So title of the keynote speech is Rebooting Communication, a Quantum Signal Processing the Perspective. So we will start the keynote speech.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to you. It's my privilege to entertain you for the next half an hour or so. And if you like the subject area, please visit our website where you would find a lot of related literature. I know this is a bit of a bombastic title, Rebooting Communications, but allow me to, first of all, really to thank the organizers for the invitation. It's a great privilege to share my thoughts with you on this auspicious occasion. And so, just so that you know where I'm sitting, I work and research at Southampton University in the United Kingdom. So my hope is you can see my cursor. This is where London is, and this is the Isle of Wight, where Marconi for the first time ever demonstrated the feasibility of radio transmissions across the Atlantic. Some of you may have seen the film Titanic, and this is where the Titanic set sail on her maiden voyage, which turned out to be that fatal journey. And so really just to tell you about the university itself, this is the building which is the home to Southampton Wireless, and down here at the bottom 3 levels we have the famous Optical Research Center, where, for example, the erbium doped fiber amplifier was invented all those years ago, and it can be found today in literally all transatlantic cables. The benefit being that you don't have to convert the electronic signal to light back and forth several times, but it can actually amplify light. So the classic outline of the paper, or the presentation rather, is I would like to give you a little bit of a historic preamble, a very brief introduction, really a rudimentary introduction to quantum computing, and a word or two about Pareto optimization, and then perhaps provide you with a few examples on quantum search aided large-scale problems in wireless, and talk about the future a little bit. So, what about the history? And I don't want to look back now all the way to Marconi over 100 years ago, but some of you are familiar with the wireless history of the past 5 generations. And we see here commencing really from the sort of 3G and 4G systems, moving on to 5G systems. And research is really a journey, isn't it? So in a way, of course, our careers and lives are also a bit like a journey. Looking back to the 2000s, these were the times when the exciting developments about multiple input, multiple output systems have been carried out. And then we look back again, the second generation GSM system used time division multiple access. The first generation was actually FDMA and analog FM. And the third generation ended up being code division multiple access. Fourth generation, orthogonal frequency division multiple access, although there were other contenders like interleave division multiple access. And I anecdotally call this the OMA-NOMA square, because so far literally all these systems relied on orthogonal multiple access schemes, but today, there's a lot of research and excitement about non-orthogonal multiple access schemes. And so OFDMA really led to the 4G square. And then there's the NOMA Parkway. I call this a parkway because it's a broad research avenue. But there are also other interesting developments along beamforming street, because the millimeter wave systems very much rely on beamforming in order to compensate for the relatively high path loss. And then we have here the large scale or massive MIMO terrace, right? Very, very popular research area. And the 5G systems are being rolled out now almost right across the globe. And so here we are, several of the keynote speakers will probably address the 6G ideas. Today, I will focus a little bit more on this quantum avenue. And really, this is what I might refer to as communications version 2.0 or rebooting communications altogether. So very nice, really. And I would like to entertain you a little more now concerning the various trade-offs in the wireless communications area so that we can then later look at Pareto optimization. So one of the most famous trade-offs is the bandwidth versus power efficiency trade-off, which is well understood. But it's interesting to note that the bandwidth is linearly increasing the capacity in Shannon's equation, whereas the power is behind a logarithmic function. Nonetheless, I return to this very briefly later on. Then, of course, in the MIMO era, we started looking at the diversity versus multiplexing trade-off, right? And so the security people are looking at the security versus integrity trade-off, because clearly, if I increase the transmit power, I can increase the throughput potentially, but the eavesdropper also receives a higher power, and hence the security is potentially more compromised. Similarly, the increased power reduces the bit error ratio, in other words, enhances the integrity. Then there's lots of other things like coverage quality and handover trade-offs. But really, come back to this in the Pareto optimal context in a minute. So I alluded to the power versus bandwidth efficiency. And what we have here on the left-hand side axis, hopefully you can see my cursor, is the power efficiency. On the right-hand side axis, we have the bandwidth efficiency. And down here, the horizontal axis is the signal to noise ratio. So it's very clear that if we have, for example, a Gaussian channel that's indicated by the red line, then as the bandwidth efficiency is going down, the power efficiency is going up, and vice versa. Typical manifestation of this is if I want to have a higher throughput and use, for example, 16-level QAM instead of the binary modulation, then I can have 4 times the throughput, but I need a higher signal-to-noise ratio, almost 10 dBs more signal-to-noise ratio. And this is why actually a MIMO system is so attractive, because with the MIMO systems, the capacity scales linearly with the number of transmit and receive antennas, whichever is smaller. So if I have, say, 10 times the power, like I mentioned for 16 QAM, then I can have 10 times the throughput as opposed to just 4 times. I will not delve too much into the effects of frequency reuse factors here or Rayleigh channels. The same sort of trade-offs are valid. Now, this spider diagram is actually quite well known already from the 5G type systems. And so in the middle, we have here the IMT 2000 system represented by these blue dotted lines, where we sort of have to strike a trade-off between, for example, latency and the achievable integrity. Particular manifestation of this is I can improve the bit error ratio if I use a longer code word, for example, in the channel codec. But obviously that increases the delay as well as the complexity. And so most of you are familiar with the ultra reliable low latency mode of the 5G systems, which is extremely challenging to implement. And really the design factors always have to obey some sort of trade-off. We briefly, again, I go back for a moment just to remind you, we mentioned a couple of trade-offs, but in reality, instead of the trade-offs, what we want is we want to determine the collection of all optimal operating points where actually none of the parameters can be improved without degrading at least one of the others. And this optimum set of operating points is called the Pareto optimal operating points. Now, as technology improves, we can, for example, improve the latency, or we can improve the throughput, we can improve the integrity. So gradually, if you look at, for example, the next generation networks, these lilac lines might indicate what might be achievable. The green line might be indicating basically what a 5G type system might be capable of achieving. But there is always trade-offs in this context. So how did we achieve these improvements? Well, the famous Moore's law facilitated the improvement of integration density by a factor of 2, typically every 18 months or so. And so when Gordon Moore set out to infer this experimental law, basically he never thought it might be valid for so long. But as you see, around 2020, we are actually reaching a transition regime, a transition region, where the integration density is about 7 nanometers, certainly on the nanometer scale. And hence, we are entering the weird and wonderful world of quantum physics. So quantum effects start to prevail, and therefore we have to either deal with these quantum effects, or we have to basically make the chips bigger if we want to have more sophisticated signal processing. But then the chips start to break up and the yield goes down. So, this option of dealing with the quantum effects is a reality today. And look at what Moore's law helped us achieve. So this white, bulky brick here is basically the 1G phone, and followed by the consecutive generations. I already alluded to this journey. Down here, we see a 4G or 5G type smartphone. And if I just compare, for example, the first GSM phones, which had on the order of 20 megaflops complexity, the 3G phones had about 100 megaflops complexity. And these are even more complex, obviously operating with
Can you hear me?
adaptive modulation encoding, sophisticated source compression, etc. And so again, Moore's law has kind of led to this trend. And so we now have to deal with the quantum effects and entering the world of communications version 2.0. So allow me to continue with a little bit of an introduction to quantum computing. And there are skeptics who say it might not ever actually happen. But across the globe, there are huge investments being channeled into developing quantum technologies and dealing with these effects that I just mentioned. And so the fiscal figures are a little bit out of date here, but it just shows that there's a global momentum, including Korea as well. You see here, although I'm pretty sure the investment going into quantum technologies today is already substantially higher. But the European Union, for example, pledged an incredible budget of 7 billion euros over the next 5 years or so in the interest of developing quantum technologies, both for the small to medium-sized enterprises as well as for the large enterprises. And so the scientific community is right behind this, where funding goes, of course, to a degree. Research has also followed. And in recent years, the IEEE actually formulated a new program, a new initiative, which is referred to as the IEEE Quantum Initiative, and about 6 societies signed up to it. So it's moving forward with a great momentum. The National Science Foundation in the United States, again, named quantum technologies one of its 10 big ideas. And in the communications field, a couple of years ago, I started a quantum communications and information technology technical committee. This is the leadership team. And my hope is that many of you might be sufficiently inspired to actually look at this frontier research area where literally nobody across planet Earth has all the answers to the open scientific research questions. So delving a little more into scientific kind of discussions now, an atom with a single electron orbiting around it has two legitimate energy levels. These are the solid orbits here, but quantum mechanics allow the electron to be in an arbitrary so-called superposition of these two energy levels. And when we want to observe the energy level of this electron, then at that very moment, it may only be found in one of these two legitimate orbits. Now, this concept of superposition is really known anecdotally also as the Schrödinger cat phenomenon, whether the cat is dead or alive, but I don't want to delve too much into it because it's a little bit of a cruel story. However, it may be worth actually really talking about this superposition from a slightly different perspective. You know, try to picture, for example, that I'm spinning a coin in a black box and I'm rattling this coin. I don't actually know whether it's in tail or head side when I actually observe it. And so this is reminiscent of carrying out operations in the quantum domain where, again, the operands are in a superposition of the classical bit and zero. It may be equally weighted or not equally weighted superposition of these. And I can have also, you know, many more quantum bits. The bottom line is that when I lift the lid of this box and observe the coin in the box, then it can only be either head or tails. And I can no longer manipulate it in the quantum domain. My hope is that this analogy fits to a degree to enhance your concept of what superposition means. So now, you know, just look a little bit at the technological side of things. And these are the first computers back in the 1950s, the so-called Manchester computer, which is a huge, big piece of hardware. And then look at where we've got to after 50 years of Moore's law. We arrived here and we've got these wonderful consumer products, which kept the industry going, kept the scientists going. And so really, this is where I feel that the quantum technologies will be also following. So the current state of the art, roughly the dual pair of the classical computers in the 1950s. This is the 17-qubit IBM computer, and it's a big piece of greasy hardware, obviously, and there is not so much you can do with 17 quantum bits. But for example, a company called D-Wave, which is a spin-off company of the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, this D-Wave computer can operate up to 2048 quantum bits. And so Intel is developing chips and the whole industry is quite excited about this. So just to really try and sort of picture the benefits of quantum computing, which then can be potentially deployed in communications, and then I allude to quantum communications as well, is that when we have, for example, a serial computer, your desktop computer, then ultimately, in order to solve a problem, we have to feed the problem into the computer one by one. It's a bit reminiscent of putting a key into a lock and trying to find the right key for this particular lock. So this way you might be viewing this as a search problem, right? Finding the right key for the lock. And I already allude to this, that in wireless, often we actually have large-scale search problems like a multi-user detection problem or a routing problem, and many others I will allude to later on. Now, by contrast, if you have a parallel computer like our university, for example, then you can actually run parallel jobs, many, many parallel jobs. In fact, in our quantum research, we have been emulating a quantum computer using a classical computer, which is, I tell you, extremely slow, unfortunately. So one has to distribute the jobs to the different nodes in the computer. But true quantum computing is capable of exploiting the quantum mechanical phenomenon of superposition. And this is why it's so powerful. And I'll come back to these later on how this property can be exploited in the context of so-called quantum search algorithms. Right, so on to quantum wireless now. Obviously, our ultimate dream is really to come up with the ultra reliable quantum internet, which is sometimes also referred to as quinternet. And so I will come back to the security issues, but actually quantum security is backwards compatible with conventional security, because quantum key distribution typically only deals with key negotiation, secret key negotiation. So it's not inconceivable that basically the next generation systems might actually opt for using quantum key distribution. So I will return to this perhaps before we conclude again, but allow me to now entertain you with 3 different application examples. The first one is basically comparing classic cryptography, quantum key distribution, and direct quantum communications. So at the top, what we see is a conventional cryptographic system where we have the plain text, which is encrypted with the aid of a secret key. But the trouble is that the key has to be at least as long as the plain text, and therefore it is quite a challenge to always generate a sufficiently high number of keys so that the security level remains as high as possible. And so there's a so-called key distribution channel, a simple modulo 2 addition might encrypt the message, and then the ciphertext is sent over a potentially insecure public channel. Now, in quantum key distribution, the idea is really pretty similar, but the key distribution and negotiation takes place over a quantum channel, and the benefit of using the quantum channel for this is that in rather simplified rudimentary terms, one could argue that if the eavesdropper tries to observe the quantum key, by the sheer fact of observation, the information falls back into the classical domain, and hence the eavesdropper no longer has access to the key, and hence it cannot decipher the message. But as you see here, actually, we really need 3 different channels. We have the insecure public channel, the quantum channel for key negotiation, and an authenticated public channel. The most promising phenomenon, I call this a phenomenon because it's not widely known as yet, is really to design direct secure quantum communications, which is not simply based on key negotiation, but the information transmission also takes place in the quantum domain. So this could be mapped to the charge of an electron or the spin of an electron. And this idea really came from Richard Feynman, who coined this fantastic idea. Instead of mapping the bits to 0 volts and 5 volts, we can now convey it using other domains. And so this is almost commercial reality today. There is a good number of QKD networks in China, not based on direct secure quantum communications. Again, it's just a key negotiation protocol. But most people actually believe that quantum communications is quantum key distribution. In reality, it's really much broader, and it's just being explored. And this is again what I like to refer to as communications version 2.0. And so the Chinese Meisha's experiment was conducted now a couple of years ago, basically transmitting quantum keys over a distance of 1,200 kilometers using free space optical communications and the satellite. The second example is a more kind of down-to-earth application in a sense, because in this community, the multi-stream detection problem is really quite well understood. And there is lots of large-scale search problems in wireless. Just to highlight a couple of them, obviously, when we have, say, 100 users and BPSK transmissions in a cell, then 2 to the power 100 possibilities would have to be explored by the base station's maximum likelihood multi-user detector. If we consider, for example, a cooperative multi-cell processing system, then we might have to deal with an even larger number, with an astronomical number of cost function evaluations. And so this is where quantum search algorithms can be very powerfully deployed. And so what I would like to next discuss very briefly, the OMA versus NOMA design trade-offs in the context of using quantum search algorithms, the so-called de Hoye algorithm, for example. So for an APSK system having 3 users, you see user 1, user 2, and user 3, we have 8 to the power 3, namely 512 points. And the quantum search algorithm explores only a handful of these. In reality, a square root n number of cost function evaluations are required when we have n points in the search space, although there's also a scalar multiplier of 22.5. And so this is the initial point, this lilac circle, and the square indicates the optimum. And the others, the gold ones are actually improved versions compared to the original initial point. The blue ones are actually also worse. You can see immediately that when we use this de Hoye-based quantum search algorithm in a classical CDMA or SDMA system, then although SDMA outperforms CDMA, where we simply use the impulse response of the users who's distinguishing them. And we have a rank deficient and the full rank system. The rank deficient system has a normalized user load of 2, namely twice as many users as the number of resource slots. And so you see that there's a certain degradation of about maybe it's a little less than 2 dBs when we have a double normalized user load, but the system still performs very well. I'm sort of really drawing closer to conclusion, but I wanted to share with you just one more example, which is basically related to using quantum search algorithms like the de Hoye, or what I would call a non-dominated quantum iterative routing optimization algorithm based on the de Hoye algorithm in out-of networks. And in this context, we could look at the coverage maps of the United States, for example, and you see that there are large coverage holes, especially in the rural and mountainous areas. The situation is even worse, for example, in the desert in Saudi Arabia. But my friend, Professor Slim Aluni, is talking at this conference about his ideas as to how to circumvent this problem. My sort of rather utopian concept, perhaps, in this context is to use what we call integrated ground air space communication systems, where everything is viewed as a mobile base station. For example, the planes could provide a much lower delay than the satellites in providing coverage for these big coverage holes in the existing systems. And of course, on every cruise ship, not under the COVID era, but in normal times, there might be 5,000 people on every ship, and hence they could be given radio coverage from the planes instead of just using the expensive satellite links. So this is the global picture, an actual picture that was taken a year or two ago now, and I just really want to conclude with a tangible quantitative example, which you can study at your leisure in one of these papers. But you might remember I started out talking about the various design trade-offs, the famous design trade-offs, and then mentioned that actually what we want is to generate the entire collection of all optimal operating points where none of the parameters can be improved without degrading at least one of them. So I would like to demonstrate this in the context of optimizing the bit error ratio, the delay, the power, and the complexity. And so this last slide basically indicates a sort of simple 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 node network. And this is the source, this is the destination, and the nodes are also potentially moving. And you see here, the Pareto front in this snapshot has 3 solutions. And the brute force method, which is based on full search, is the blue square. The red circle is our non-dominated quantum search algorithm. You see that every single time the quantum search algorithm succeeded in finding the optimum solution. And so its complexity portrayed down here is indicated by the green crosses. See that roughly an order of magnitude reduction was achieved in terms of the complexity when optimizing the 4-component objective function of having the bit error ratio, the delay, transmit power, and complexity. I haven't even touched upon a lot of associated issues, but my hope is that I was able to raise your interest in this subject area. And please drop me an email if you would like to discuss any of the ideas that I touched upon a little further. But thank you so much for your cordial attention.
Thank you for great talk. And then the Professor Hanzo is online right now. And then on the floor, if you have any question, then we can ask to the Professor Hanzo. But we have to use another mic to him. So I'm gonna translate actually to another mic. So if you have any question, let me know, and then I will ask the Hanzo. Professor Hanzo, are you there? Professor Hanzo, are you there?
Yes, I am.
We just finished the video, so I'm asking the question to the audience on the floor.
That's fine, yes. Hope you can hear me well. I can hear you quite well.
So, there.
Hi, Professor Hanzo, can you hear me?
No, you have to use that mic.
Hi, Professor Hanzo, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I'm Yoon Kim from Korea University. Probably I'm one of the 73 with quantum researchers in South Korea. And thank you for the nice talk. Okay. And my question is, once we have enough qubit of quantum computing, probably in terms of complexity, we might have advantage. So my question is, in terms of consuming energy processing a bit, do you think still have quantum technology has advantage of the classical computing?
I believe that this remains for the future to be decided. Obviously, when Gordon Moore set up his law, he never expected to be valid for so long. And I think we are only really seeing the tip of the iceberg in quantum technologies. I couldn't agree more that currently cryogenic technology is not power efficient, but there are, of course, much better solutions, and there's this ongoing debate between the D-wave type simulated annealing quantum computers, as well as the gate-based, universal gate-based quantum computers. But I think the first applications will not really be in quantum computing, it will be in quantum communications, and there is already dozens of quantum networks in China in operation. I stop there and await your next question.
Okay, thank you very much. My another quick question is, which generation, 6 or 7, might start to have the quantum technology in the standardization, do you think?
To ask to him to repeat the question.
I think in general, I am optimistic that even the sixth generation will be able to use it because, as I mentioned, quantum networks are already in operation, and quantum key distribution is perfectly backwards compatible with the existing system. So even in 5G, it could be deployed retrospectively because it's a key negotiation protocol. But when we move on to the next generation technologies, and this is where the real challenges are for us as a communications and signal processing and computing community, is the quantum secure direct communications, where we no longer just negotiate quantum keys, but we actually communicate in the quantum domain.
Okay, thank you very much.
So, on the floor, do you have any other question? Actually, he spent very valuable time for the question.
I don't know whether the issue was crystal clear or I was totally out of context because normally I get a plethora of questions. Indian colleagues are particularly argumentative. I was involved in a panel discussion just a week ago, and I was showered with questions. And just to mention really that last week, the first ever quantum engineering conference took place, which was supposed to be in Denver, but it was a virtual conference, and 800 different quantum engineering people attended, a whole plethora of amazing tutorials and amazing keynotes.
Actually, on the floor, we have about 200 people, but in this conference, actually, 750 persons registration. But here is about 200 people, but just only one question. So,
Just really stimulate the audience a little further. I don't know whether, am I on video or just on audio?
what do you say?
Can you see me or you can only hear my voice?
We can see
Okay,
your voice
okay.
and the video, yeah.
Okay, so
You
if
have,
anybody's...
the yellow shirt, yeah?
All right, yes. If anybody is interested, I can recommend to you this light-hearted magazine of the IET, which is now a year old, but it has an amazing array of compelling applications of quantum technologies, starting, for example, with the quantum internet. And obviously, there are huge challenges in this context because obviously we need quantum repeaters, and the quantum repeaters need quantum memory. But my mission is really to try and bridge the gap between the classical and the quantum communications community. And there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from the classical communications. And many of these are also mentioned here. For example, quantum radars. These will see where conventional radars cannot see. It will
be able to detect stealth planes, and we can use quantum imaging. For example, these quantum cameras will be able to really see things, because we know about ultra-wideband communications, for example, which is very good for localization based on its short wavelength. And of course, in quantum technologies, when we use light, then the wavelength is even shorter. We have about 800 terahertz frequency for the visible light. And the applications carry on. Obviously, currently it's a bit like that old-fashioned computer that I had in the slides, and it will also revolutionize atomic clocks, for example. It will be much more accurate, so it will help even stock market trading, and I mentioned sensing underground, but it will also transform travel, for example, in very mysterious ways, because we know about the endeavor in the wireless community where we want to make driverless cars work well. Traffic management is, of course, really a nightmare. But if you look at the article here, for example, Volkswagen are already testing a quantum managed localization system, which would manage, with the aid of the parallel observation of cars, pedestrians, vehicles, etc., the whole complexity of the traffic. So I guess.
So actually, we are very thank you for your great talk, because the next the speech person is waiting for his turn. So would you the closing remark for your talk?
Thank you so much for your cordial invitation. I very much enjoyed my collaboration with my Korean academic family. So bless you all and enjoy the conference. Wish you a great evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. It is very difficult to mix online and offline. So this conference is very challenging, the test actually. We have another keynote speech. Keynote speech title is Human-Centered AI for the Hyper-Connected Post-COVID World. It will be given Dr. Yoon Kim. He is a CTO at the SK Telecom Korea. So please welcome with the big hand Dr. Kim.
Good afternoon and good evening. I want to first thank the organizers of ICTC, including Professor Park Se-eun, the chairman of the Communication Society of Korea. I am an AI person. I did not major in communication networks. It was fascinating to see Professor Hanzo's lecture, though, because my PhD was actually on convex optimization. So it was great to see the Pareto optimization and quantum physics and quantum technologies that I'm not familiar with being a part of the next generation wireless communication. It also reminded me of the fact that SK Telecom, which I joined 2 years ago, had been investing in quantum technologies for communication for several years, culminating in the acquisition of a company based in Swiss called IDQ that builds quantum random number generators and quantum key distribution technologies. And so we're trying to commercialize these technologies in real networks in South Korea. And I look forward to having more engaging and technically stimulating talks and chats with Professor Hanzo. Today I'm going to talk about AI, and I'm going to talk about the technical aspects of AI, but more importantly, the non-technical aspects of AI. I think the theme of this conference is data, network, and AI in the so-called untapped world. I'm sure you've talked about data and networks a lot today, so I'm going to talk a little bit about AI, but it's not going to be a technical talk. There will not be a lot of equations. As a matter of fact, none. But I think it's an important topic for people in the field of ICT convergence to realize the impact of AI and what it's doing to the humankind. So I call 5G an intelligence superhighway. Remember, the internet was called the information superhighway by Al Gore. I think 5G is the start of networks that actually can enable the blurring of physical and virtual worlds. And that's why I call it an AI superhighway. So at SK Telecom, our vision is to actually connect people with things, other people, businesses, and societies. And 5G is a perfect example of how we do that. But we can't do that with a dumb pipe. We have to make the pipe really smart, and that's where AI and cloud comes in. Now, that's from a consumer's point of view. What happens if you really have a truly fast, reliable, low latency, massively connected network with elements that are intelligent, that have some AI elements? Well, from a consumer's point of view, you have the physical world, which is a street. But that physical world will be mapped with digital virtual elements. So as 5G technologies are enhanced and augmented by hardware and software advancements in AI and also in mixed reality, I think the boundaries between the physical world and the virtual world will be very blurry. And we're already seeing that through applications such as communication, gaming, immersive media, smart factories, and other applications. I'll show a couple of examples of that that we're currently working on at SK Telecom. Sorry, this remote is not working really well today. So at SK Telecom, we're just on the cusp of introducing these 5G-enabled experiences that actually blur the boundaries between the digital world and the physical world. I'll give you a few examples. One is cloud gaming. So just this fall, we announced a partnership with Microsoft Xbox so that people with 5G networks with 5G smartphones can actually play games anywhere they want using their mobile devices and their smart devices. This has been catching on pretty well, especially among the people who have familiarity with the Microsoft Xbox gaming world. Another example is multi-view. We just launched this where people can actually watch the players that play these games, esports, and we can actually broadcast multiple streams of videos so that if it's a multiplayer game, you can watch the players that play. You can also watch the audience. You can even actually have YouTubers comment on them, and all on a single video stream that gets multiple streamed. Also, you can watch now concerts untagged. So you can actually watch your favorite guitarist or drummer or vocalist perform. And you can also watch them separately or in unison. And so that's another application of 5G hyperconnectivity reaching the general masses. Now this one's interesting. So I think this is the first example where now you're thinking about hyperconnectivity with AI. And this example, I've prepared a video. Hopefully the sound is not too loud. So cover your ears in case it's loud. But anyway, this shows a smart factory that has these robots move, and as the parts are moved through the conveyor belts, there's an AI vision camera that looks at these parts, and they automatically detect defects using AI that's on the edge, which means the camera, as well as on the mobile edge, which sits between the camera and the factory and the 5G mainframe. So I'll show you an example of a video. Whoa. All right, here we go. this is kind of a fancy version of an actual factory that we commercialized. It's a small factory, and it uses automated robots and elements and cameras to real-time detect defects as they go along. And we also have a 5G base station as well as a 5G-enabled mobile edge computing infrastructure so that we can actually get the latest and greatest vision AI models downloaded there. And the processing happens on the edge. So you have both privacy, latency, and security all guaranteed within that factory site. So that's a defect. It's detecting. And that's our 5G station. So now we're expanding this application to a variety of things, so not only defect detection, but actually predicting when it's going to fail, regular maintenances. We're using drones and vision-based robots to actually roam around the factory and give a lot of inferences on what's happening. So this is just a start. As you can see, the physical world of the factory is now being virtualized right then and there with AI. Next slide. All right, so that's the 5G portion. I'm an AI expert, so I'm going to talk about AI. When you think about AI, the first thing that comes to mind to most consumers is AI assistants like Siri or Alexa or Google Assistant or Nugu in the case of Korean consumers. So my background is I've been building AI assistant technologies for the past 20 years. So I'm going to talk about, on the AI side, what consumers are experiencing now and what the future holds in that field. Next slide. So the evolution of voice-based assistants actually happened from a company called AT&T. You very well know this company. It's a telecommunications company in the US. They started an applications back in the 1990s where you actually call a call center, and instead of a human being answering the phone, a computer answers the phone and asks, "How can I help you?" And then the actual consumer says, "Well, I have a problem with my bill," or "I have a problem with my device, I lost my phone," and so on and so forth. And then it routes that request to the appropriate department and the personnel that can help them. This is called call routing, and it used speech recognition as well as a little bit of natural language understanding. So this, in my opinion, this is kind of the real ancestor of the voice assistant. After that came Siri, and that's 2010. So about 10 years passed, and Steve Jobs wanted to make sure that his smartphone is capable of helping people using AI. So he called Siri an AI, but it's really not an AI assistant. I'll explain later. After Siri was introduced in 2011, Amazon said, well, we can't just sit around, but we don't have a phone system. We don't have a smartphone ecosystem. What we do have, though, we do have an opportunity to attack the home with a home speaker that listens to you from far away. And that's when the Amazon Echo was born. That was 2015. And quite recently, a couple of years ago, this is still in beta mode. It's not really fully commercialized, but there is a technology called Google Duplex, where the AI now calls a beauty salon or a restaurant on behalf of its owner to make reservations. So you can see that the first three, I guess, applications are human initiated. You either call, or you call Siri, or you press a button to talk to Alexa or to say, "Hey, Alexa." The next one, the Google Duplex, is actually AI initiated, which means AI starts the conversation. And that is a little different when you look at human-machine interfaces, and you have to design the entire system differently. If a person calls, the person has a very specific request or intent that the machine needs to understand. If a machine calls, it's usually to help the human being complete a task, like making a reservation at a restaurant, or at a beauty salon, or other types of things, or making travel reservations. So, how are the assistants today? Well, we just got iPhone 12 announced with the bionic chip called A14. My team was a part of the A14 chip development team, so I know very well what that technology is. It's basically nothing but just deep learning networks being accelerated within the phone, so you can actually compute DNNs really efficiently, right? And what that means is you can actually run speech recognition and image recognition and moving video recognition on the phone without the help of the cloud or the network. And it also actually guarantees privacy and security to a certain extent. So the trend right now is AI assistants because of a lot of reasons, but mostly because these phones have become so powerful, is that AI happens on the device, local processing. That's trend number one. Trend number two is that AI is now kind of expanding into wearables. So in a few years, you will see these, how many of you have AirPods like this? AirPods? Okay. So this is what I call a hearable. It's not a wearable yet because I can't really do anything with it. I wear it to actually hear something. But we will have AR glasses and other types of wearable devices where AI assistants will become very interesting. Because in that situation, it's very hard for you to control a device. If you have a smartphone, you have a touch screen, so you have an input mechanism. But if you have an AR glass, it's really hard to control things and to actually maneuver. There is something called gesture, but it's physically tooling and it's not really complete anyway. So I think in that scenario, AI assistants will become a major element of the human-machine interface paradigm. The last is personalization. So Siri actually now, you can program Siri to do certain things. If you say good morning to Siri, you can program it to actually open up your curtains, start the coffee machine, and do a lot of different things. So consider as kind of a personalized voice macro that you program it to do. So it's getting more personal. It's helping your personal life become a lot better, not just anyone's. So in terms of human-machine communication, AI assistants were introduced to help people get things done better on a smartphone. But even before AI assistants came along, there was something called the search engine. And that's, to me, a predecessor to a voice-based assistant. You used text keyboards. We still do, actually. We still use keyboards to type into a search engine to get information. And that's why Google and Naver and other people and other companies have thrived and flourished in that era. Right now, I think the human-machine communication is kind of text plus speech. Sometimes you text, sometimes you call an AI, or when you're driving or when you have a wearable, you can call AI and converse with it to get your things done. I think the next generation, along with text and speech, is going to be mind. So what that means is that the AI will understand what you want before you even speak, because it would have had a lot of data that's stored on devices and other services to understand you better. So it would know after you wake up that you usually have Americano coffee during weekdays, but lattes during weekends. So it's going to understand what you want to do. Of course, it'll confirm and ask you, but you won't have to really say anything. It'll be predictive. It'll be mind reading, which is very difficult but possible. So where are we all headed, right? Where is this going? On the AI side, I see it as the following. As I said, 5G blurs the boundaries between the physical world and the virtual world. And AI and mixed reality helps the consumers negotiate and switch between the two modes quite easily. Because AI exists in the digital world, and we, for the most part, exist in the physical world. So there will be people with these personal AIs, whether they're Siri or Alexa or call it something else. There will be people with personal assistants that help them. Either with a smartphone or a wearable or some sort of an ecosystem, you will have a personal assistant in the future. Maybe 5-10 years, maybe sooner. Of course, there will always be people without AI because it's technology after all. And there are people who just don't like technology, who don't like being monitored. The Big Brother syndrome really concerns them. They do not want to give any data to the network, to the AI, so they will live without an AI. And that's the upper right-hand portion. Now, in order to serve people with AI assistants and people without AI assistants, there has to be businesses that are equipped with AIs of themselves or for themselves. So businesses will have to equip themselves with AI. So in the future, you could see a situation where an AI of a business talks to the AI of a consumer person. And it's going to be an AI to AI communication as opposed to an AI to human communication and vice versa. Of course, the business AI still needs to talk to the human beings that don't have AI. And that's a difficult thing because humans are very difficult to understand. They're very finicky, they're very unpredictable. They're mostly consumers and customers are king, right? But they are often quite unreasonable. So we need to have AI to understand these consumers without AI. And across every application imaginable, I think AI will be a central intelligence element. 5G would be the AI superhighway that connects these intelligent elements with itself and throughout the world in super high speed, super reliable environments. And mixed reality will help us actually see the digital world from a physical world's perspective. That's my view of how consumers will be affected by 5G, hyperconnectivity, and AI intelligence to the next level. So that's kind of the technologist's view of what's going to happen. But there is a dark side, and this side is very important for you to understand, and that's why I've coined my title to be human-centered AI. There is a dark side to AI that you may have heard about, and I'm going to maybe, I'm going to unravel it. I'm going to give you some myths and some facts about it, because when you read these articles, a lot of the articles are technically inaccurate. So we'll go one by one. Next slide. There are bias risks, and this is definitely real. What that means is, in order for AI models to work well, you need to have data to train it. And mostly data is something like a language data or a vision data or image data and speech data. Imagine you only have speech data for native American English speakers, such as myself, right? If you have something like that, what's going to happen if a non-native English speaker talks to an AI that only has heard American English accents? It's not going to be able to understand it. Thus, it's going to reject that non-native speaker, and that's bias. What happens if, let's say in Korea, a person living in Jeju, who has, by the way, a very distinct accent and a very different language, what if Google Assistant does not have any data for that Jeju island accent? What happens is that Google will not be able to understand anything that this person says, and that's bias. Same with gender, same with age, same with other things. So we have to make sure that there's no bias in the data to exclude or preclude people. And it's very important because not only because it won't work, and not only it's because of social problem, but also if it doesn't work, people won't use it. If people won't use it, you don't get data. If you don't get data, you can't improve. So there's this vicious cycle that you run into. So you have to make sure that the initial systems, AI or otherwise, have to be bias-free. And that's very difficult. A few years ago, the Google AI mischaracterized a black person, an African American, as a gorilla. And that created a lot of fuss and a lot, as it should have, a lot of issues. There are much more subtle issues, such as nurses being coined as female and doctors being coined as male. Same with all other things. The language that we use has inherent bias in them. The AI does not know that something's wrong. It just basically consumes the data and it actually then learns from it. So it's the responsibility of the human beings to make sure that the data is not biased in any way to hurt society. And that is the responsibility that is solely upon the researcher, the modeler, companies like SK Telecom who deploy these models into the real world, right? There's security risks. So on the left-hand side, you may have heard this or saw this. There's a stop sign that is recognized by the vision AI as a stop. But if you add a seemingly naive, innocent, random set of perturbation images, if you add those two up and you feed the addition into the AI, it suddenly thinks it's not a stop, but a yield sign, which is catastrophic if you think about stop versus go, right? So these adversarial attacks can happen with people who want to fool the AI into thinking that stop is not a stop, but an yield. And if AIs are deployed in situations that are mission critical, you can see what the ramifications could be. Next slide. Now we're talking about hyperconnected intelligence and 5G everywhere and AI everywhere, but right now we're all wearing masks, except for myself. What that means is that Mother Nature has told us, guys, look out. You gotta watch out, or else there's more wrath coming. There's ESG impact of having a hyperconnected intelligence society, and we have to be aware of it. Next slide. For instance, compared to 8 years ago, today's typical AI models are 20 million times larger. 20 million times larger. And what that means is that a typical AI model consumes about 626,000 pounds of carbon dioxide, which equals the same amount that is emitted by 5 cars during its lifetime. Just one AI model, right? And one typical normal AI model. Next slide. There is this abnormally large AI model, though, called GPT-3. You may have heard it in the news. It's a language processing model that was developed by a US company called OpenAI. And what it does is it basically consumes all the English text that's ever known to mankind that's been digitalized, about 300 billion words. And it's about probably 100,000 times larger than the model that I showed you that actually had 5 cars worth of carbon dioxide. It's the largest model made in history with about 175 billion parameters. And in terms of GPU time, it consumed about 355 years of GPU time, which is astronomical. Next slide. Now, what does it do? It actually creates language on its own. So it kind of, creates articles, or you can create sentences, it can complete sentences, it can answer certain questions after reading it. So it is human-like, which is really interesting to a lot of people. It's not interesting to me because I know what it does. It's not smart, as a lot of people think. But it does things that surprises people, right? So the article that you see on the left-hand side, it's actually a blog article, and it put down the top 3 articles that were most viewed on that day. It turns out that it was fake. A student using GPT-3 actually created a fake blog, and it got consumed, and it got popular, and then it was top 3 blog article. So you can see there's a social value problem, there's a social issue problem with things like GPT-3. In addition to the environmental and sustainability problems, there's also an ethical issue that we need to deal with when we have AI like that. Next slide. So that brings me to properly developing AI, whether it's for network communications, or human-machine interfaces, or for creating articles, or understanding human language. I think there needs to be a fundamental set of principles that we need to abide by in order for AI to help the world and not hurt it. And I have primarily 4 keywords to denote what that means: human, machine, experience, and together. So humans, in order for AI to really be important and critical, we need to understand how human beings work and how they think and how they act. Because to me, the definition of AI is a set of software and hardware technologies to help people get their jobs done more accurately, more promptly, more easily, more naturally, more safely. It's about human beings. It's not about the machines, right? So in order for the AI to be ultimately helpful to human beings, we have to understand what human beings want and need. Humans have a lot of needs. They have needs that machines don't have. For instance, they have something called an emotion. We all have it. It's a chemical reaction, but it's an emotion. We have something called empathy. we really like challenges. I don't know why that person is really trying to do that in a snowy mountain, but that's his life. He wants to do that. That's his will, and that's his want and desire and need, and maybe even a purpose in life. And we're very creative. We can create a lot of different things. AIs can't do that. They don't have empathy. They have bits, but they don't have empathy, right? So humans and machines are very different. We have to design them very differently. And I'm very concerned that a lot of people in the AI community are trying to mimic humans, and that's really not a good idea. Because, first of all, you can't mimic humans really well anyway. Secondly, even if you mimic humans, you can't really help humans by having a mimicked human. Machines can be a lot more helpful to humans if they can do the things that they really do well and humans cannot, right? Which brings me to the next point, machine. Oh, I'm sorry, the right goals. So humans have these types of goals that the UN set. These are the Sustainable Development Goals. They're called SDGs, and they basically are all of the world's problem, boiled down to about 18 or 17 issues. We have to work on those. And I think 5G can actually help a lot of the goals, along with AI and cloud. Next slide. Machines. So machines basically operate under the assumption that there is a goal and something called an objective function. And people in optimization know this. There's a certain set of functions you want to optimize, subject to a certain set of constraints. For AI, a lot of the times the objective function is to reduce the number of errors, precision and recall and F1, all those measures, just increasing accuracy at the expense of speed and cost and other things. But for the most part right now, the current state of the art AI wants to reduce the errors. If you look at things like Siri, the objective function is to minimize the number of errors that it makes. So if I say call mom, it has to call mom. If it calls Monica, then that's an error. And they want to eliminate it or reduce it. If you look at a medical AI that tries to use vision AI to detect certain defects or diseases of the lungs, then there's two types of errors it makes. One type of error is it thinks someone has the disease, but someone's healthy. They don't have a disease. And the other is someone does have a disease, but the vision AI misses it. These two types of errors are the same error, but if in the objective functions, you have to bias the second set of errors to be extremely important, much more important than the first one, because it is catastrophic again if the AI misses someone has lung cancer. As opposed to if it misses a healthy person and it misclassifies them as someone who's not healthy, then there's some cost and pain, but it's really not that critical, right? So objective function-wise, minimizing a certain type of error is very important to a medical vision AI. Now, on the other side, there is Facebook and YouTube. Now, these guys are AI gurus. Basically, they use AI technologies to increase their business and really improve them. Facebook actually wants you to look at a certain article and click it and share it as much as possible so that the network of people who look at the article and its ads is maximized. YouTube has an objective function in a similar manner. If you have a video and they suggest something, the suggestion AI, the objective function is to maximize the number of clicks when it's suggested to the user. That was the machine-centric objective function a few years ago. Now, what has happened? What has happened is that on YouTube, at that time, when my son puts in the question, is the Earth flat? About 70% of the YouTube videos that YouTube AI suggests says yes. And it shows all the videos that prove the Earth is flat. What has happened is that the AI objective function maximized clicks. And because it was fun to adults, hey, wow, Earth is flat. Okay, I'm going to look at this. The YouTube AI basically said, oh, this must be the truth. And it actually boosted the probability that the suggestion was recommended. And so our children basically, if they're not careful, they might understand the Earth as being flat according to YouTube. Same thing happens with Facebook. There's so many fake Facebook groups that got created, especially on vaccinations. The harm of vaccination, it's just crazy how diverse these lies are. But to a person who doesn't know about vaccination, they join a group and they talk about vaccinations and think this is the truth. So there are social ramifications of AI objective functions. And luckily, YouTube and Facebook both figured this out. And now they have constraints and other types of objective functions so that harmful content, socially acceptable type of demeanors are also baked into the equation. But that makes the math really hard. So the AI researchers are struggling to make the objective function be differentiable and be it'll converge into a certain local minima, right? Or optima. Objective functions are very important for AI. And I think objective functions are very important for networks too, by the way. Next slide. Experience. So just like 5G, I think people really need to experience 5G or 6G or advanced networks to really feel the power of it, right? And to really feel like this technology is helping them. AI is even further because AI, again, takes care of the negotiation between the digital world and the physical world for human beings. So human and AI interfaces are very, very visceral, and they have to be considered into the entire equation of whether a technology is useful. So experience is very important for AI. If the experience does not help a human being, I think an AI is pretty much useless, if the goal was to help human beings. So, next slide. We had a pretty special experience called COVID this year. And I don't think we're going to go back to the way it was. We're going to have a new normal. And so that opens up opportunities for AI to help. And you've heard about AI being used to help in the synthesis of drugs and other medication, and also for AI to help predict the next pandemic. We at SK Telecom, we thought about what can we do to help the COVID pandemic. And it was a little idea that an engineer came up with. We originally said, I really want to get onto a subway train in a busy time where there's not a lot of people, so I can sit down. So they had built algorithms in AI to predict that. And then COVID hit. So we changed the idea. We said, okay, what if we were to provide a service where people can actually look at the real-time updates and our predictions of how crowded a subway train could be at a certain given time for a certain station for a certain train. So that service is actually up and running on TMAP. And so that's one way we can help. Now that can be expanded to, if I want to go to, let's say, a shopping mall, a coex mall, or an airport or something like that, and you can actually check to see what the AI predicts as well as what the real-time update is of how many people are in that vicinity. So you can actually, use it for your analysis of whether it's going to be COVID friendly or not, right? So that's another way that data, location, network, and AI can help. The last example is mental health. I think one of the very silent killers of this current pandemic is that we are all getting a little bit sicker mentally. You may have heard of COVID blues, right? Where people are stuck at home and they can't really touch people. And so that actually has psychological and mental impact on you. And it's very silent because it's not evident. We were just frustrated. But as this goes on, and the fatigue, and it wears you out, I think there's going to be a new set of mental diseases that we don't know about yet in the next decade or so. So I think AI can really help solve the mental health problem and issues that are not well understood right now, and even for diseases that are not even invented or created at this point. So mental health, very important. Location, COVID ability, very important. And of course, finding drugs, very important. So human experience evolves. And in this case, actually, it just radically changed. We have to make sure AI goes along with it and we have to create technology to help people survive and thrive in this era where unpredictability is predictable, right? Next to last slide. Together. This is very important. Why? Because right now, AI feeds itself on data that humans provide. Machines provided them as well for smart factories, but in a human AI context, AI can only evolve and grow with human data. It cannot grow otherwise. So what that means is that AI needs to help human beings, and while helping them, they need to have a trust relationship built in so that the human beings can actually give more data to the AI. And then not a vicious cycle, but a virtual cycle. Next slide. So how do we build this? How do we build a human-centered AI that evolves together? This is one way to do it. So I call this the human AI feedback loop. It's kind of an engineer's rendition of what I think AI and humans should do. So, as I said, data is very, very key to AI being better. So you can see right now what's happening is that there are AI scientists there that build the algorithms and the models and technology so that AI models can recognize your speech or understand your image or your face. And then what happens is that because at first we don't have any data on the upper hand side, we have to prepare data. And this is where the data processing comes in. This is where the labeling comes in, because without labeling, AI cannot understand right now. So we have to label and give the AI the answer to the question with data. So if you give labels and data, then out comes a model, and you can then have AI engineers that put together a system that does something, whether it's speech recognition, or whether it's image recognition, or whether it's self-driving cars. The system has to be built. And then we need to train them and test them. Make sure that it's actually fit for the commercial world. And then you have labelers again that they label data, and then you have AI managers that look at a deployed commercial AI service like Nugu or like TMAP service or self-driving cars in the future. We have to make sure that we have these AI managers once the AI is deployed to make sure, like we manage people, we have to manage AI. We got to make sure there are people to do quality assurance and checkups to make sure the AI is not making very heinous mistakes. And then the last thing is, we should have done this from the start, but we don't have it right now. I call them the AI designers. These are people who look at the problems of this world. Not an engineer's problem, but a society's problem. Very important problems like hunger, education, elderly, environment, employment, things like that, right? And then work backwards to formulate what technical problem can AI solve to solve that type of social problem. And I call that the AI designer, and that's missing in this industry, not just Korea, but in the world. But the first company or country or a school or organization to come up with really cool AI designers is going to change the world. That's my view. So that's the human AI feedback loop. You design a problem, you collect data, you build an AI model, you deploy it, and hopefully it's good enough so that people use it. And then there's a feedback loop coming back. From the deployment comes back data that you can use to make better models, and comes back data so you can learn from the service and make it better. You can even learn from the data to actually define or even change your problem from the first hand, right? So that's the feedback loop. So, last slide. This year I learned a very important thing. I'd only considered human-centered AI. In other words, machines have to help humans, and we got to actually design objective functions. We got to do R&D in the same way. But this year, I realized that we have to make sure to optimize human, machine, and Earth, or else it's not going to work. It's not going to be sustainable. Technology is going to help accelerate the destruction of the world as opposed to helping it. So that's my message for today. Thank you so much.
Now again, thank you for a great talk. And then on the floor, do you have any question? He's spend valuable time, so we have to ask something. So, question, yeah.
for your great presentation. My name is Yoon Kim from Korea Tech. As you said, your presentation is not technical prospect, so I want to ask some kinds of things. As a student who wants to enter your SK Telecom in the near future,
sense that, oh, technology is not everything. Humans are everything. I gotta like meet people now, and I gotta like drink with them and have meals with them, and I gotta look. And then I actually met friends in Japan and England and the U.S. that have very different perspectives than I did. I was just I grew up here. I went to Christ, and double E was my major, right? And then these people told me about the world that I had never learned about. So I read a lot of books, and there were a lot of people who influenced me. Another is, I worked at Apple, and Apple is all about making products that help people. And it's kind of ingrained in their DNA. And then I come to SK, and SK Group, SK Chairman, his number one principle is social value creation. And he wants to actually have people, including customers' families, and their loved ones, and even, not only investors and customers, but even our employees. He thinks that happiness is number one. So it's, I'm being influenced by a lot of people on the business side, but it's still very hard because as an engineer, you have that habit, right? Yeah.
Okay, so quick question and quick answer, please. You have to prepare to setting the table for the banquet.
So my question is all about the 5G network, and I'm kind of curious how the integration of 5G to the previous networks. Because right now we kind of like going really fast with the 5 and now the 6. So how is the integration for the previous technologies in this? Are we just going to push them away?
Right. The question is not on AI, but we're talking about 5G adoption and how we integrated the new 5G technology, software, hardware, and services otherwise with the previous generations, right? That's the question? Yeah. So I'm not a wireless expert. Professor Choi and others are. I'm not. But what I can tell you is that LTE and the fourth generation systems have been so much optimized here in Korea. There's just nothing else to optimize. And so what we had to do was we had to actually exceed the customer expectations in 5G. And you know that 5G has SA and NSA modes. So non-standalone and standalone. Right? So what we had to do was we had to deploy 5G, which is a new element with all basebands and different things and technologies in there. And we had to deploy it alongside 4G, which was working very well already. So how do you do that? So we built a technology that combines the both. So the anchor is 4G right now. And there's a lot of 4G stations in Korea. It's so good, right? But when there's 5G connectivity, and when there are 5G devices, the 4G LTE works alongside 5G, and it basically provides the sum of two bandwidths. So you can get higher bandwidths than 4G or 5G alone. That's how we're solving it right now. Of course, there are shortcomings to that approach, but we think that approach is the best approach right now, considering South Korea's situation, where LTE is fantastic, and we have to, slowly but surely deploy 5G countrywide and nationwide. And if this is the first time to Korea, then that's one thing, but South Koreans have a very, very, very high standard of wireless quality. It has to work everywhere, and it has to be fast, reliable, and 5G has to be 20 times the speed of LTE, which is not possible. But anyway, they have these expectations. So in order for us to meet those expectations, we had to actually build it from 4G, then to 5G. Now next year we're going to do the opposite, because 5G SA is going to come along. So we're going to go 5G, anchor, and then 4G. But that's an evolution as opposed to a revolution. So that's how we're integrating the two different technologies. Did that serve as a good answer for you?
Yes, if you have any more questions, we have the banquet time, so please use the banquet time because we have to prepare the banquet table. So again, thank you so much. Thank you very much for great talk. Okay, before wrap up, I would like to announce the banquet. So in here we have a banquet place, but we have about 20 minutes to set up all the tables. So everybody will go out and then bring with some fresh air and then come back here about 20 minutes later. Thank you very much. My name is Yoon Kim from University. Thank you very much.